Hello. Yes, I'm a GIS librarian, and that is what sparked my interest in this subject. When I first came to MSU as a GIS librarian, they'd never had a GIS librarian before, and there was a lot of hubbub at that time in the library about accessibility. And the question I kept getting asked over and over again, and at the time it felt almost hostile, I'll be honest, was, well, how are maps accessible? How are they accessible? And I didn't have a good answer. I still don't exactly have a great answer for that question, but it's definitely been something I've been thinking about ever since, just about 6 years now. I don't think that this is a subject that is tied up with a bow. There isn't a perfect set of guidelines, there isn't a perfect answer here. And in some regards, which I'll talk about, I don't think that there should be. So the frame I want to use, and I will say that the talk yesterday, there was a talk on accessibility and map making yesterday by Amy Ellison, and a lot of bits and pieces of my talk, the gist of the recommendations are the same. So in some ways that was very reassuring. It's like, oh, we are thinking on the same page. But I have a slightly different frame than what she has, and I think that it's a useful frame, which is why I kind of want to present it here. And the other thing that I should preface this all with is that part of my reason for presenting here is that I want to have a discussion. I want to talk to people about this. So if you are interested in this, I really, really want to talk to you. I tried to write about this, like an article, and I'm dissatisfied with the results of that. And so I'm hoping, that's kind of why I came here. I was like, okay, I want to get input from people. Because I'm not really a cartographer, I just teach people cartography. Okay, but the frame that I use, which is different than the presenter yesterday, is kind of universal design. And universal design comes out of architecture, primarily. But it's kind of wended its way into popular culture. You probably all have heard about it, but it's designing all products to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible. And what I like about that is that it's kind of a paradigm. It's a goal rather than a specific set of guidelines, and it is aspirational. And it recognizes that we might not be able to do that. There's limitations, right? We're never going to make the perfectly accessible object. That doesn't exist. So all we can do is try and make things as good as we can. So general comments here. Sight is a range. So usually, obviously, maps are very visual, typically. And so that is the primary impairment that we consider ourselves with when we're trying to make them more accessible. But it is a range. And a lot of times people jump immediately to blindness. What can we do to make maps for the blind? And that's great. It's a good thing to do. But impairment, so having vision problems, is a lot more common than blindness. And so that's kind of the broader target audience. And there are other types of impairments that might be considered in regard to 2D map making, especially cognitive impairments that we can start thinking about too. Thinking in terms of improvement for everyone is, in my opinion, a better frame than accommodation or trying to appease government regulation in some way, right? So how can we make this more comprehensible for everyone, not just for those that are potentially sight impaired? And universal design as a paradigm kind of rejects that notion of accessibility as a checklist, which is why I like it. That type of attitude about the checklist, I've seen that come up. Recently, the IT department at my university had to remove a lot of web maps from our website and replace them with static images that could have alt text because of their idea of accessibility checklists that they had for web accessibility. So it's an issue. And to me, that was a really bad decision because ultimately those web maps are in some ways more accessible because people, as long as you have a search box that you can tab into, which is the critical bit, you can search for a place and then zoom in. And so people who are sight impaired might find those web maps actually more accessible than the static object, regardless of the alt text, right? So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say that I'm fighting, let's maybe not do the checklists. So there are alternatives to print maps, obviously, that people have thought about for accessibility, and this has been around for a long time. Even before 3D printers, we had sort of micro swell papers that you can put in little machines and they would raise up. There's one in the map library at Michigan State. But now people are starting to 3D print maps. There's obvious limitations here. And so there have been lots of studies, and these are actually quite effective for teaching people about terrain and understanding of spaces. But if you wanted to navigate with one of these, you'd need an awful lot of tiles. You know, there's obviously some inherent limitations to this type of approach. And I've thought a bit about this, but it's like, how do we then overlay other types of data onto this? Because right now we've got terrain and we've got locations, but how can you get, you know, how many things? And apparently there have been some studies done that basically say that 8 symbols, you know, you can put a bunch of different types of symbols on here and actually get intelligibility. But again, limitations. And not everyone has the capacity to 3D print maps, and most people are doing this for print, right? So that maybe is a way we should be thinking about it, is how do we make print maps accessible? In addition to print, sonified maps. So that's another thing that people have come up with as an alternative. And those are great. And that also brings up the kind of broader range of thinking. If you think about when we're driving, right, essentially we have an impairment at that point. We cannot look at a map while we're driving. And so, so thinking about, again, accessibility isn't just about disability or people that have physical impairment. It might be that you're holding 2 bags of groceries and can't get a paper map out, and it would be better to have your phone buzz to give you navigational directions, you know. So thinking about it kind of broadly is also helpful, I think. But again, sonified maps have kind of limitations. They're great navigationally, but are they great for data? Thought about how to do elevation, like in tones, and sometimes that works, but again, limitations. And also, as we say, print maps are kind of the most common maps, so thinking about those is important. So when I was kind of struggling with what to do about the print maps, like how do we make those more accessible? I found the WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And I looked at them, and what the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are is guidelines for making your websites accessible. And they've been around since 1999. I think they're on 2.1. So they've been iterated on, and they're quite broadly accepted. The European Union actually uses them in some of their sort of legal guidelines for websites at this point. But the ones that I thought that I pulled out of there that I think are the most relevant for map design and good to think about are kind of the obvious ones, right? So color, which I'll talk about briefly, is not the only way that information should be conveyed. Contrast is important, so that's the second bullet point. And there are specific guidelines given for what ratios to use for maximum accessibility. Especially text needs to have a very high level of contrast. All non-text that is presented to the user has a text alternative. And basically what that means is if you're embedding things into, if you have an image, it needs to have alt text. And even print stuff, if that's OCR so that somebody's reading it with optical character recognition, you know, having that caption that is in text rather than embedded in the image is important for that type of comprehension. The last bullet point basically means if you don't put your legend, if you embed your legend in your map, and that is the way that you're presenting it in a web content or a web context or other context, pulling that legend information out into a caption that is OCR readable be a good idea. Because if you have the title of your map in your JPEG or your TIFF or whatever it is that you're putting the map in, and you have your legend, those are not readable, like that you put them in the alt text or you put them in your caption. Otherwise, people are not going to be able to access them if they can't read the text. They might be able to kind of see the map, but the text might be lost. So the critical ones, though, I think are the first two. So color can be a problem, but I feel like we've got this sussed. I feel like map makers have been thinking about colorblindness and issues around colorblindness for longer than almost anyone. We've got tools built into our GIS products to deal with this. And there are other disciplines I put up here. 3D imagery for medical context, like there's a lot of research done on how to approach color in those settings. And there might be some overlap for thinking about color ramps there. That might be interesting. So a lot of different areas are thinking about this, not just cartography. And I feel like we kind of know how to do this. So that's good. But the thing that we haven't done, I don't feel like, and that I see a lot of maps and I'm like, ooh, sepia tones, which are great and beautiful, but also, as far as accessibility goes, the contrast may not be high enough there in a lot of cases. So contrast is really the most important thing for people that have vision impairment to see objects and make them discernible. And so if you want to make your 2D maps more accessible, I would suggest upping the contrast. Very simple. Because that is one of the things that is most consistent with a lot of guidelines, including WCAG, is contrast. And there are a lot of contrast testing tools out there. Basically, if you do a web search for a contrast testing tool, you will find some. So you can plug your colors in there and see what their ratios of contrast are. All right, and this is the scary part for me. I'm not really a cartographer, so don't get mad at these terrible maps. I did want to show kind of a demonstration of what this might kind of look like. And this is the kind of very simple map that I'm helping people make all the time. People come rushing in, they've learned QGIS last week and their dissertation defense is tomorrow. So I've got to get them going. And so we're making simple maps here. So this is kind of the not improved version. So the shades of gray are not in a 3:1 ratio. There's no borders. We've got a base map that is probably not relevant to the information being conveyed. All of which kind of are impinging on what I would think of as the accessibility of this map. Okay. We have an embedded legend, which I would probably put out in a figure notation if I was going to present this in an article or something like that. So what do we do with this? It's really simple. Add borders. Because the instant you add borders, you've upped the contrast between your objects. And in this case, I simplified the number of bins. So in this last one, I've got 4 bins. Do I really need 4 bins? It's always the question, because if you want to have the higher contrast option, then having fewer classes is going to let you do that. So one way of kind of increasing that intelligibility is reducing the number of bins that you've got. And if I really was on the ball, kind of like, notice my legend, I probably should have rounded those numbers for cognitive understanding of that, improvement there. So those are all things that you can do to kind of easily improve legibility on a map. So those are examples. So these are questions that I have that I don't have great answers to and I'm thinking about. And if you all have thoughts on these things, I would love to hear them. So questions for you, turning this around a bit. I do wonder about these, sort of thinking about these guidelines and thinking about high contrast things and the sacrifice of aesthetics. Because in some ways, the softer grays and the colors that are not high contrast and the lack of borders and those types of things, maybe not as aesthetically pleasing, and maybe if you're going for an old-style, old-timey map, you're not going to have those high contrast things in there. And so, what's the balance? If folks have suggestions for references, if there's any brilliant author that's written about this that I don't know about, because I don't know of any, that would be fabulous. I'm trying to think about how to conduct research on this. So in other words, putting a map that sort of meets the guidelines in front of somebody and putting a map that doesn't meet the guidelines and testing how much information people can get out of both of those maps. Do these things actually work? And that's basically what I'm thinking about, but then it's sort of what populations? I've even thought about retirement homes, because those populations might have kind of reduced eyesight and also interest in looking at maps for someone. But if folks have thoughts about that, I would love to hear about that too. And any thoughts you have, really, because I think that this is a discussion that might be valuable to have. So, thanks. I'll just repeat your question.
Do you think all about accessibility outside of physical limitations? I'm just thinking about people who might be challenged in other ways. Language skills, conceptual frameworks, that kind of stuff.
Yes, but not as, I have not thought as much about that, and I have not delved into that literature as much. I do think that, question was, have you thought about broadening this beyond sight? Sort of shortening your question a bit, but, into cognitive impairment, other types of impairment. And yes, but also I do think that addressing the sight issue addresses some of those other issues. Because in order to get at the sight thing, you're doing a lot of simplification and that, or hopefully doing some simplification and thinking about, okay, do I need that base map? Or am I adding unnecessary clutter, right? And so simplification also helps some of those other issues, I think. But it is something that I'm interested in. I just, Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's kind of what I was getting at with talking about sonification, right? So it's like, yes, that benefits people who are blind, but it also benefits me when I'm driving my car, right? And so looking for those kind of opportunities where you can make things better for everyone is kind of the goal, really. And lowering cognitive overload, I definitely think is one of those things. Like, yeah. Thanks.